So over on the wall, we have a number of stained glass. And one of those shows a picture of Jesus as the shepherd. And it's an image we're familiar with. It's kind of back in the middle there. An image that we're familiar with. And even if we've never been a shepherd, even if we've never been around sheep, we at least have some idea of what a shepherd does. I mean, it's somewhat familiar to us because many of us, if not personally, know someone who has an animal and what it's like to care for an animal and to take care of the animal, the need for feed and watering and the animal's reliance on us. And so we can get a picture of when we see Jesus as the shepherd, we begin to get a picture of what that means to us. The book of Hebrews, the letter to the Hebrews, the sermon to the Hebrews has a different image, though, that it uses. One of the prominent images in Hebrews is Jesus as the high priest, or as the great high priest. Now, while being a shepherd might be somewhat familiar to us and a little bit strange, the idea of a high priest is often very strange. We're not sure what exactly is a high priest, and we maybe have some images in our mind. Maybe we're kind of picturing someone in a robe, and they have strange jewels on their chest, and we're picturing sacrifices and smoke and animals and altars and blood, and maybe that's the picture we have, but we're not exactly sure how that works or what exactly that has to do with Jesus. And so we're going to begin to look at this image today. It's not going to be the only time. We're going to return to it several times because, like I said, the preacher of Hebrews, the writer of the letter, uses this image a lot. And so there's lots of different ways this image is explored. And so we'll take some time each week to also say, what does a high priest do? What is it like? What does that mean when we think about who Jesus is to us? And so we're going to start near the end of chapter 4, where Teresa read. Chapter 4, verse 14, and it begins with a therefore, which indicates we need to say, what came before that? What was said before that? And so what came before chapter 4, verse 14? Well, chapters 1, 2, 3, and part of 4, right? And so what happened in those? Quick summary. In chapter 1, we're introduced to this idea that God has spoken to his people. And that God continues to speak, but the greatest way that he has spoken is through Jesus. That's the greatest, the most clear, the most perfect, the most accurate representation, most accurate revelation of who God is through Jesus. We're also told about Jesus, the nature of Jesus, that he is fully God, that is equivalent, that he's equal to God, that he was there at the beginning, that he's eternal, that he has all the attributes of God, that he is fully God. But we're also told that he's fully man, and so there's this mystery. Jesus is fully God, he's fully man. In other words, and by man, fully human. Meaning that Jesus understands what it's like to be human, understands the frailties, the weaknesses, not only of the physical body, but temptations and all that means. And then the writer, the preacher goes on and continues and says, God has called and invited us to rest. And rest not simply as a place, but being in the presence of God, invited us to be with him and to enjoy his peace, his presence, his rest, all that he gives to us. And we're called to enter into that rest. And then he tells a story about how the people of God at once were called to a physical place that represented that. But they lacked faith. They lacked obedience, and so they didn't enter in. And so there's this warning and saying, we need to do the same thing. We need to be obedient. We need to have faith. We need to trust to enter into God's rest, which puts us on a little bit of trembling because it ends, the verses right before that say God's word is like a sword that pierces. In other words, it's saying we can't hide who we are from God. God knows what's going on inside of us. He knows about our faithfulness. He knows about our obedience, and he's inviting us into this rest, which then maybe puts us on this little bit of fear of saying, well, wait a minute. God has invited me into this rest, but he's calling me to be faithful. He's calling me to be obedient, and I want to enter this rest, but I'm worried. And so it happens then with chapter 4, verse 16, where it begins, it says, therefore, since we have a great high priest. And so one of the things we want to start with is, what is a high priest? And we're going to look a little bit about what the high priest does. The high priest was mentioned a couple times earlier in the letter, in chapter 3, but then in verse 2:17, it says, for this reason, he, that's Jesus, had to be made like them, fully human in every way, in order that he might become a merciful and faithful high priest in service to God, and that he might make atonement for the sins of the people. So one of the key things is the high priest had to be human. In order for Jesus to be our high priest, he had to be human so that he could be merciful and faithful, so he could understand fully what it was. And then there's the note about atonement for sins. Come back to that in a few weeks. But first, get the picture. So one of the things that made Jesus able to be our high priest was that he was human in every way. And then we're going to come back. I'm going to come back to this verse. I'm going to focus on these first few verses, 4:14 through 16. But I want to look a little bit what comes after that because it explains more about a high priest's duties and qualifications. One of the things is we have to say, well, what qualifies someone to be a high priest? When we think about the world around us, there are certain jobs where you want people to have particular qualifications. If you go in to have surgery, you want to know that the doctor performing the surgery, she or he, has gone to medical school and has performed it, and preferably has performed this type of surgery before, and probably a lot of times. And so they have experience with doing that. If you take your taxes in to a CPA, you want that person to have certain qualifications. If you step on an airplane, you want the pilot sitting in the seat to have qualifications. And so it goes through lots of areas of our life that there are certain qualifications you want people to have for particular positions, just about any position that exists. You want them to be qualified to fulfill that role. And so one of the things that the writer here is going to say is, why is Jesus qualified? And it's going to continue on, not only in this chapter, but then later on at the end of 6 and then 7, 8, 9, 10, why Jesus can be our high priest. But then we also have to think about this. So it says, we could go to Leviticus. Remember, we did Leviticus back in the fall. And so we could go back to Leviticus and read all about the qualifications. But the writer of Hebrews is nice and gives us a few quick summaries of what the qualifications are to be a high priest. So in chapter 5, verse 1, every high priest is selected from among the people and is appointed to represent the people in matters related to God, to offer gifts and sacrifices. So selected from among the people. And that's that representative idea, that they come from it. They can do that and be a part of the people. They're part of the people they're representing. And their role is to offer gifts and sacrifices. And so they understand the weaknesses of the people. And so that's one of the key qualifications is if you want a high priest, they need to understand who you are and what your weaknesses are. But even from that, there's a qualification, but we have to ask, what's the priest's job? I mean, why do they need that qualification? Why does the priest need to be able to understand our weaknesses? What exactly is the role of a priest or the job of a priest? And so we're going to step back and take a big picture role of that and kind of think about it in this concept, this way of looking at it. That for the Hebrews, for the Israelite, in the biblical mind, there's this sense that there are two spaces. There's earth, that's the human space where we live, and then there's heaven, which is God's space. And there's a separation between those two. And so the invitation is we want to enter into God's space. And the way to do that, there's certain rituals and rites given to do that because that separation has been created because of our sin. And so the priest fulfills the role of helping us enter into that presence. But they don't do it directly. So in the Old Testament, and a quick picture is, there was a movement from far away to closer to God. There was a tabernacle, a tent for a while, and then a temple. And within that temple, there were kind of courts and movement. There were places where the worshipers could come, and then there were places available only to the priest. And then there was the Holy of Holies, where only the high priest could go once a year, and that represented God, where God was. Now, for you and I, if I were to ask you, well, where's God? We could say, well, he's everywhere. And in some sense, an ancient Hebrew would say the same thing, but the ancient Hebrew would also say, when you'd say, where's God? They would point and they'd say, there, at the temple, there in that place. And so what would the priest do? The priest, a worshiper would come, they'd bring some sort of offering. Might be an animal, might be some bread, might be some flour, whatever it was. They'd bring that to the priest. There'd be some rituals they'd go through, and then at some point the priest would then take that offering, and there's different kinds of offering, do different things with it. In some cases, it would all be burned up. In some cases, they would enjoy it as a meal. But they would bring that offering and bring it to the altar. And they would also bring some of the blood in the altar. And then as that offering was consumed as smoke, it would go up to God as a pleasing. And then the priest then would enter into the holy place, and then once a year into the high holy place. And so you can see what's happening is this sense of the priest is taking the gifts of the people, which represents their prayers and their worship, and bringing it to God. And the hope is that God will receive that gift. God doesn't have to. This isn't a magical thing where you just got to put your quarter in. And so it's this process where God is receiving our gifts, but the priest is the mediator for that. You can't just walk in. You didn't just walk into the temple with your gift and drop it down in front of the altar. You didn't just walk into the holy place and bring it. Instead, the priest served as the representative and went through a whole process to do that. So one of the things the priest has to do is the priest has to understand your weaknesses, because as you're bringing the gifts, they're representing you. If you send someone to represent you, they need to understand who you are. We think of maybe in a court case, you have a lawyer, an attorney who's representing you. Would you want an attorney who doesn't understand anything about you or your stories? You want somebody who understands you. And so in this sense, the priest is representing you. So one of the qualifications for the priest is that they can understand your weaknesses. And so there's this concept of movement. But it's not a volunteer job. Somebody didn't just become a priest by raising their hand and saying, I want to be a priest. But instead, in verse 4, it says that no one takes this honor on himself, but he receives it when called by God, just as Aaron was. There was a process for appointing a priest. In fact, the priests, up until this time, they had to come from a certain family. There was a genealogy. And we're going to come back to the genealogy in a few chapters, but the importance of genealogy. There was a background to that. And they offered the prayers and the petitions, and it says they offered the prayers and petitions. And that was the main point of chapter 2, was this whole idea of them being one of them. And then it also goes on, it says you are a priest forever in the order of Melchizedek. Melchizedek we're going to get to in 2 weeks. We're going to talk all about Melchizedek. So you're wondering, who is this Melchizedek guy? Why does it matter that Jesus is like him? Wait 2 weeks and we're going to hear all about him. And so the high priest, in a summary, we've got high priest is what? Someone appointed by God to offer gifts and sacrifices to bridge the gap between people and God, to bring their gifts into God's presence. So that's your picture of when we're talking for today, that's the important concept. Someone bridging that gap and bringing the gifts into the presence of God is the role of a high priest. So now we come back to the start. Therefore, since we have a great high priest who has ascended into heaven, Jesus, the Son of God. In other words, Jesus is the great high priest who has ascended into heaven. Let us hold firmly to the faith we profess. Jesus, the Son of God, in other words, the one who is both man and God, has ascended into heaven. And heaven is what? Heaven is God's space. So Jesus, in kind of this spiritual image, has, like the priest who goes in and enters into the temple, into the Holy of Holies, the physical space of God. Now Jesus has entered into heaven, which is God's place. And so he's like the priest entering into the holy place. And so we're getting that picture. Jesus is the one who has entered into the holy place. And since he is our high priest, we're told to hold tight to the faith we profess. Hold tight to the faith we confess. In other words, when our times are challenging, when our hearts are prone to wander, we grow weary, this high priest understands us. He's tempted but did not sin. And that's what it says in verse 15. He says, for we do not have a high priest unable to empathize with our weakness. We have one who has been tempted in every way, just as we are, yet he did not sin. So we're holding tight to this confession that Jesus was without sin. We're holding tight to this confession that he understands us. We're holding tight to this belief that he knows who we are. Hold tight to the faith we confess that he is fully God and he is fully man, that he understands all that we are. It says because that's our high priest, we hold tight to that. That's the high priest we have. So let's hold firm to that. Hold firm to the faith that in Jesus God has forgiven us. In Jesus, God has made us holy, that he's given us life, that he's given us the power of the Spirit. That faith is the only way to cling to Jesus. So he's saying, hold tight to that faith because we have this high priest. And so in other words, we can think about it. God wants us to enter his rest, to be with him now and forever. Jesus is already in that rest. So let's cling, let's grasp to the confession that Jesus alone is the way, the truth, and the life. That's what we're inviting to cling to when he says, we have this high priest. Jesus has done this, and so now we're invited to cling to the faith, but also to cling to him. But what I really want us to focus on most of all today, so we're getting all these pictures in our head, is verse 16, because that's the good news I really want us to hear today. And it's that knowing that we have Jesus who's our high priest, who can sympathize with us. Jesus understands what we go through. Jesus understands the troubles, the trials, and he's offered up cries and prayers and has been heard. And that was one of at the end of it there, he says in verse 7, during the days of Jesus' life on earth, he offered up prayers and petitions with fervent cries and tears to the one who could save him from death and was heard. So we're coming to Jesus who knows what it's like and he's praised. He can sympathize with us. He's ascended into heaven. That is, he's been received by God. Because remember that concept of the priest? The priest brings the offering into God. And the question is, will God accept the offering? Well, Jesus has come into the presence of God and is sat down at his right hand. So has God accepted his offering? Absolutely. So we have this picture. God has accepted his offering and now he's there. And so we have all that in mind. And now we come to verse 16. Let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence, so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. Approach the throne of grace with confidence. The throne is what? The place of God's presence. And so it's an invitation to come into God's presence and to offer our prayers and our worship. And so we think back again to the story of God's people, because when I told you about the priest, remember how he said, could anybody just go into God's presence? No, it was just the high priest, and into the Holy of Holies was once per year. And so you didn't simply enter into God's presence, but now we have something different going on. Now, because Jesus is our high priest, and because of the kind of high priest he is, we can enter, and in fact, we're invited to enter. That something different has changed. And we're invited not to enter, not just once, but this is an encouragement to go in regularly, to hear that language of, let us then approach. And it's kind of like, it's an invitation that's open now. It's an invitation that will be open tomorrow and next week and the week after that. Come into God's presence and to go in regularly, in the language of to draw near rather than turning back. And it's a contrast between let's draw near to God, enter into his presence. And we think back to the story of God's people. They came to the place of rest. They came to the land that they were promised. And instead of going in, what did they do? They turned back. And now it's saying, now we want you to go in, to enter in, to draw near to who God is. And then it goes on and it says, we're to go in, language here, so we let's then approach the throne of grace with confidence. Some of your translations may say boldly. You know, boldness from who the high, is it a boldness because we're so good? No, it's a boldness because of who the high priest is, because of what Jesus has done. You know, we're not going in with boldness to see God because we have great ideas or great character, but because we have a great high priest, because that's what it says. Therefore, since we have a great high priest, let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence. Because Jesus is our high priest, we can approach with confidence. We can go in knowing that we enter because of Jesus. And so I like the way Tom Long says it. He says this about this passage. He says, indeed, the preacher, and Tom Long, a commentator on the book of Hebrews, uses the word preacher because he understands the letter to the Hebrews primarily as a sermon. He says, indeed, the preacher's main purpose is to encourage the congregation toward daring, even audacious prayer to approach the throne of grace with boldness. He goes on, the preacher wants them to move past fearful prayers, tidy prayers, formal and distant prayers, toward a way of praying that storms the gates of heaven with honest and heartfelt cries of human need. I know my prayers are sometimes fearful. Sometimes they're tidy, they're neat. I got my little words I want to say and I get it out of the way. Formal and distant prayers. and instead move toward a way of praying that storms the gates of heaven with honest and heartfelt cries. That we can come to God and whatever's going on. There's not a need to say, well, I've got to say my prayers in the right way, or I've got to do the right words, or I'm not sure, I've got these emotions. I'm mad right now, I'm sad right now, I'm terrified right now, and I'm not sure. And what Tom Long is reminding us, what the writer of Hebrews says, approach the throne with boldness, with confidence, because we have this high priest who understands all those things. And then he concludes this way. He says, he does not want them to pray like bureaucrats seeking a permit, but like children crying in the night with their fears, trusting that they will be heard and comforted. And so it's this picture of saying, this is what's going on when it says, let us then approach God's throne of grace with confidence so that we may receive mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. That we approach with boldness, that we approach with everything that's going on, that we can come into God's presence with whatever we're feeling, whatever's going on inside of us, the emotions, the turmoil that's going on inside, because Jesus understands all of that. But it gets even better. I mean, you think that's good. First, we get the idea that we can come and we can pray to God. We can just go in his presence and give him everything. But not only can we go, it says what? So that we may receive. We receive what? Mercy and find grace to help us in our time of need. We find mercy. Remember, the Hebrews is about a call to perseverance. It's about the fact that we're called to enter into this rest. We're called to be obedient to who God calls us to be. We're to hold fast in times of discouragement and drift. And the reality is we miss it. We don't always do what God calls us to do. Sometimes we get discouraged. Sometimes we turn away. Sometimes we turn away from what we believe. Sometimes we turn away in the way we act. Sometimes we choose our way over God's way. And what it's saying here is that when we come into God's presence, we can find mercy. We can find a God who gives forgiveness, a God who understands. Because, remember that high priest, Jesus, who was like us in every way, understands, because he lived as a human being, he understands the kind of things that we go through. So we might be discouraged because there's some part of us that's not changing as fast as we'd like it to. We might be discouraged because we thought we were past something and then it comes back up. We might be discouraged because it feels like we're stuck in a pattern. We might be discouraged because we keep turning to this way of life that is not the way of life, but our own way instead of the way of Jesus. And so we come in and we're invited in. It says, because Jesus is our high priest, we can come in to God's throne. We can come into God's presence, and there we will find not condemnation, but mercy, because Jesus is our high priest. It's saying that whatever's going on in your life, wherever those places are where you are struggling with, whether it's being discouraged, whether it's with sin, whatever it is, you can come in because of Jesus and who he is. You can come into God's presence, and there you'll find mercy. I mean, it may be something that's, a feeling of not being good enough even, or something God has exposed with you, whatever this high priest can sympathize, and you'll find mercy. And notice what it says. We receive mercy and find grace to help us. It says, let us approach God's throne of grace. I mean, the name kind of gives it away, doesn't it? I mean, it's not the throne of judgment. It's not the throne of beat down. It's not the throne of smack you in the face. It's the throne of grace. And so we're invited to come and approach the throne of grace, which tells us what? That it's a place where God is going to give. Because grace is simply the word for gift. And then it goes on. He says, not only do we receive mercy, not only do we find forgiveness because of, from the things we have done, but we have grace, it says, to help us in our time of need. Because we often think of grace simply as forgiveness. We simply grace as the gift we're given to us. But grace is more than that. Grace is a gift given to help to change us, to make us different, to make us into who God has called us to be. So when it says, and find grace to help us in our time of need. Now notice the preacher, the writer, doesn't say what all those times of need are. Because if we were to take a moment here and ask, we realize all of us have different needs, don't we? And what I need today might not be the same thing I need tomorrow. But what it's saying is when we come into the presence of God and we're able to come in because of that high priest we have and come to the throne of grace, we can receive grace, we can receive strength, we can receive peace, we can receive what we need to help us in our time of need. Maybe it's doubts about our faith and that we receive this gift of faith. Maybe we need reassurance about God's presence. Maybe we need faith. Maybe we need more love. Maybe we need more patience. Whatever it is we need, what the writer is reminding us is we have a high priest. And because Jesus is our great high priest, Jesus who understands us, Jesus who has entered into God's presence, Jesus who has done all those things, has come in. Because of that, we can come in boldly before God. We can bring all those things. We can bring ourselves with confidence, with boldness, like a child crying out in the middle of the night. We can come in and we can bring those. And when we do that, it doesn't fall on deaf ears. It doesn't bounce off, but instead we have a God who hears and gives us mercy and help in time of need. And so what I want to do as I conclude the message here today is I want to take a moment and just allow us some time to do that. What I want you to do is just take a moment here. We're going to go into a moment of silence and simply close your eyes and enter into God's presence because of what Jesus has done. Say, I have a great high priest, and now, God, I can come into your presence with boldness. And now I don't know what you need today. Maybe today what you need most of all is his mercy. If you need his mercy today, come and ask for it. But if there's some help that you need, something going on and saying, I can't handle this on my own, God, I need your help, come and ask him for your grace. So let's go now all together as individuals and approach God's throne with boldness.